How did the Zulus interact with the Voortrekkers? The Zulu-Boer War of 1835 to 1839. This one's going to be quite a trek to get through, 21 minutes, but we can do it, boys.
So recently on the channel, I've been looking at the Zulu in this video and this one, which you can both watch. There'll be cards and links in the description. Now, previously I've also looked at the Boers, who are another people that lived in South Africa, in videos like this one, for example, on the history of South Africa, this one on the Great Trek, which is also available in Dutch, and finally this one from a very long time ago about the First Boer War.
Which we
And
did
by a
watch,
long
very
time
good.
ago, I mean a long time ago. In this one, I'm going to take a look at how did the Boers and the Zulus interact with one another. So first, let's take a look
Lots
at
of
the
shooting.
Boers. And what's important to remember about the Boers in this period is that unlike the British when they came marching into Zululand, they weren't an army. They weren't one solid group that had an objective. They were descendants of Dutch settlers that came in, but they were actually family groups that came. They sometimes chose a leader and followed certain leaders in different trek parties, but they were ultimately just individuals and individual families. They were descendant of the Dutch, but we shouldn't be imagining, let's say, a Dutch army fighting against the Zulus, although that would be a very interesting alternate history. Now in 1814, the Cape Colony that had been Dutch before became British for the last time, and the British took control of the Cape Colony in South Africa. And this led to, in 1835, a lot of the descendants of the Dutch inhabitants were disgruntled with this. It led to what became known as Die Groot Trek in Afrikaans, which is the Great Trek in English.
Yeah.
And essentially they packed their belongings and their families into ox-drawn carts and trekked into the interior of Africa looking for a new place to live. That's why they're called the Voortrekkers, essentially the guys who go on
The Forerunners, boys.
the trek, and this is their nice flag. Now, the region they came into was already inhabited by various groups, various tribal groups, like Xhosa, the Sotho, the Nguni, and the Zulu. Although I should say the Nguni, the Zulu are an Nguni tribe, but these were different Nguni tribes that lived in this area. And they came into this area, they sort of skirted around the area of the Sotho. The Xhosa actually helped them to enter the area of the Zulu because they wanted a buffer against this expanding state. So in about
That is also true. I remember talking with some Xhosa guys who are pretty well versed in history who mentioned this.
1835, 1836, they entered this area. I've covered the Zulu before in two different videos, and at this time they were an ascending empire or an ascending kingdom. They'd recently been a really insignificant tribe, but at this point they became incredibly powerful. They started to push other tribes out of certain areas and expand their influence. They were very militaristic, and that's what they needed to keep going and to keep their system going, was essentially to be at war all of the time. Now the Zulu,
They're basically the orcs. Yes. But he didn't have any red paint. They would have gone so hard.
actually,
Then they
through
would have
their
gone
rise
fans.
to power, had potentially initiated something that was called the Mfakane, and this kind of means the crushing in various Bantu languages. And what it essentially meant was that lots and lots of different tribal groupings that had lived fairly peaceably together beforehand were suddenly on the move and were suddenly being forced out of their territory, as well as fighting with other tribal groups that then came into their territory, a bit like the Volkswanderung in Europe. And it's estimated that potentially somewhere between 1
That's a lot
and
of
2
lives
million
lost.
people died, which is incredible considering these were people being killed with very simple spears, and also famine plays a part as well. So it's not just out and out killing, but the fact that so many people died in this way is incredible. And it's possible actually that this meant that there were whole tracts of land that had been
It's free real estate. Ah yes, 2 million people die and leave their homes empty. Voortrekkers. It's free real estate. Woo.
completely deserted by these tribal groups because of the great disruption that had been caused in the region. So with this as a possible motive, the Boers come, or the Voortrekkers, one of their parties being led by Pieter Tief, comes and speaks to King Dingaan, who at that time was the king of the Zulu, and to put him into context, he's the half-brother of Shaka, and he is probably the mastermind behind the assassination of Shaka, and he then became king He did this in 1828, but we've moved on to 1835 by this point. Now, Piet Retief, who is the leader of this group of the Voortrekkers who'd come into this area of Natal, which borders on Zululand on the coast, he agreed with the King Dingaan that he would retrieve some stolen cattle that had been stolen by another tribe, and upon the completion of...
I actually wondered how that happened in terms of like translating what the other person is saying. I'd be genuinely curious to see like a recreation of how they actually held the conversation, because I assume, you know, none of the Voortrekkers spoke Zulu, none of the Zulu people, you know, they spoke pretty much no Dutch, so that would have been interesting how the actual negotiation went. Remember when your first three viewers were your brother, me, and a Polish woman whose name I can't say? Yeah, I do remember, man. You guys will... And that Polish woman was actually the first viewer ever on my channel, so I'll never forget it, man.
This task, that he would then get a tract of land granted to him by King Dingaan. However, when he returned with the cattle, Dingaan instead ordered that they were seized and massacred the party. And then straight away after this, he sent out his Zulu regiments to go and attack all the Voortrekker settlements, all their wagons that were stationed in the Natal region. And this led to a massacre in which several hundred of the Voortrekkers, many of them children as well and women, which particularly shocked the Europeans because other tribes, even ones they'd been fighting for ages, like the Xhosa, they never killed the children of the Voortrekkers, but the Zulus they did. And this became known as the Wenen massacre. There's still a town in South Africa called Wenen there today, which in Dutch means weeping. So that's a bit of the etymology of the local area there. But this is after he had already signed, King Dingaan, this document that the Voortrekkers claim that they found on the bodies of Piet Retief and his companions.
Yeah, that's doctor's handwriting. No ways you guys can get me to read that.
You can see it there. That does give the land to the Voortrekkers. Now, we have to wonder, why did King Dingaan kill the Boers after he got them to take the cattle?
Probably because he was retarded.
Now, the Voortrekkers document, if you read it, does contain several fairly thinly veiled threats about how many tribes they'd already defeated on their way there, and, you know, saying, well, we'll do the same to the Zulu if you don't agree. And as we know from the Zulu, they were a very proud people. They'd really strongly risen to power and had dominion over a lot of other tribes. So it's possible that this sort of rubbed Dingaan the other way and thought, actually, I'll teach them a lesson. It's also possible that Dingaan actually never intended to give them the land and simply
I think this one is the most likely.
Used them as a means to capture the stolen cattle and then thought, I'll wash my hands of them. And potentially also the fact that it's recorded that before he ordered the killing, he said, Burulani Abathakathi, which means kill the wizards. So it's possible that...
So he thought the Voortrekkers were wizards?
Thought that they had some kind of supernatural powers associated with them, potentially because of the different skin color as well, and that's why he mistrusted them and decided to kill them. But we're not entirely sure. Now,
I mean, there are still things down here, little superstitions that people have down here about people with white skin, specifically albinos.
The Boers, the Voortrekkers, they didn't take this lying down, and those that remained looked around for help and found it in the neighbouring Boer Republic of the Oranje Vrystaat. And they asked for help, and they've put together what's called a commando. Now, you might think this word looks very similar with the difference of the K, and that's true because the English word commando comes from the Afrikaans word that comes...
Oh, okay, I didn't actually know this. I thought commando was based off the English word commando, but apparently it's the other way around.
Comes in because of the Boer Wars. And essentially what a commando was this armed group of men. Think of it like a posse in the United States, but then made up of Boers instead. And this was still the main military unit. It was armed on horseback. It was very versatile, very mobile.
We were cowboys.
Long-range fighting as well. These were marksmen initially, and this was still the main method of the call-up of men during the Boer Wars as well. It was led by two men, by Piet Uys and by Hendrik Potgieter. Both of them were
I actually met people with the last name Potgieter, believe it or not.
Voortrekker leaders who'd led bands of Dutch-speaking inhabitants from the Cape Colony out into the interior of South Africa. And they met the Zulu at the Battle of Italeni. Now, what occurred here is that they basically dismounted from their horses after sighting a Zulu regiment and opened fire on them, inflicting, fairly heavy casualties on them. Now, this should have been the end of the battle, but unfortunately for the Voortrekkers, two brothers actually managed to get cut off from the rest of the party, and they were being surrounded by the Zulu. So Piet Uys and several others, this was after Hendrik Potgieter and his party had already retreated away, thinking the battle to be over, moved in to intervene, but they were cut off and surrounded by the Zulu, who promptly killed them, and so this went down as a defeat for the Voortrekkers. Because Hendrik Potgieter's party had already retreated away at this point, his group of men that fought at the Battle of Italieni became known thereafter as the Vluchtcommando, which means the flight commando, the commando
I can confirm that this translation is true.
that was put to flight. But in 1838, there would be another decisive engagement against the Zulu, and this was at the famous Battle of Blood River, or Bloedrivier in Afrikaans. Now, an eyewitness account of the battle does survive, and I'm going to read a little section of it for you. I'll have a link in the description to the full account of the journal, where you can see the movements of the Voortrekkers before and after the Battle of Bloedrivier. And it's in early 19th century Dutch, so I'll read it in the early 19th century Dutch, which is an interesting activity because at this point Afrikaans really isn't that different to Dutch. Kids used to...
Zondag, die 16 december, werd voor ons als geboren, die lucht was open, het verdaar klaar en helder. Nauwelijks zag men het schimmerlicht aanbreken of die wachten die nog op hun posten waren in... Okay, I'm actually surprised that I can read this despite this being another language. Yeah, that's just kind of how close Afrikaans is to Dutch. Now, there's like a lot of words here that aren't in the Afrikaans language, but because the pronunciation is basically the same, you can more or less read it. It's kind of like the difference between Old English, like Shakespearean English, and modern English. Yes, technically speaking, the same language, but there's quite a number of differences.
learn Dutch when they were...
But if you can speak one, you can understand the other.
the wagons, for example, but then the spoken variant began to sound more and more like Afrikaans does today, and you can see some elements of that in this, but I'll put the English on the screen, but I thought it would be nice to sort of get the flavour of the language that the Boers were speaking at the time in this. So I'll read it in Dutch, but I'll have the English on the screen there for you at the same time.
I think Zondag is probably what later became Zondag, so I assume it's going to be Sunday.
Zondag, de 16e december, werd voor ons als geboren. De lucht was open, het weder klaar en helder. Nauwelijks zag men het schermen
This guy's really good, damn. I'm impressed.
aanbreken, of de wachten die nog op hun posten waren, en nauwelijks zien konden, ontwaarden dat de Zulus aan het naderen waren. De patrouilles nu waren alleen, en het leger daags tevoren bij malkander geroepen, door alarmseinen met het kanon. De vijand dan naderde in volle vaart, en eensklaps hadden zij het lager van alle zijden omsingeld. Onderwijl werd het licht, zodat men hen konde zien naderen, terwijl hun voorgangers reeds waren teruggeschoten. Hun aannaderde leverde, hoewel akelig door de grote macht, echt een schoon gezicht op. Zij naderden bij regimenten, ieder kapitein met zijn manschappen achteraan, zodat hadden de patrouilles daags tevoren hen ook zien opkomen, tot allen ons omsingeld hadden. Ik konde hen niet tellen, doch men zegt dat een gevangene kaffer het getal van 36 regimenten opgaf.
Okay, here we go.
Welke regimenten men ten getalle van 9 à 10.000 man moest
900 to 1,000 men. That's pretty good.
berekenen. Het gevecht nu ging aan.
Wait. Each regiment was 9,000. Sorry, each regiment was 900 to 1,000 men, and there were 36 of them. So there was tens of thousands of these.
En de kanonnen werden uit ieder poort gelost. Zo werd het gevecht hevig, zelfs in het schieten met kleingeweren, zo van onze als van hunne zijde. Nadat zulks nu ruim 2 uren op het horloge had geduurd, gaf de hoofdcommandant orders, terwijl de vijand gedurig het lager bestormde en hij vreesde dat onze ammunitie verminderd zouden, dat de poorten geopend en te paard tegen het gevochten moest worden. Dit werd gedaan, en tot onze spijt vloten zij zo erg dat men hen in vele wegen moest achternajagen. So what Jan
I'm genuinely flabbergasted at his skill in reading that. He really did do his research. I'm surprised just how much effort he put into that. Most people probably would have just posted it up and just like read off the English, but he tried his best, man. Props to you. Bye, donkey.
Is describing here in his journal is essentially a grand Zulu attack of many thousands of warriors against the lager of the Voortrekkers. Now, a lager essentially is when you get all the wagons and you put them in a circle. This is also what you saw pioneers doing in the Americas, for example, against the Plains Native Americans, because then you create a defensive structure on the plains that's very effective at holding back the enemy. So you see that, for example, at the wagon box raids against the Sioux Native Americans.
It's literally turtle formation, boys.
The US Army used this effectively, and this is what the Boers are doing. This is a technique that they formed the lager to fight against native tribes, because then they could keep everyone safe on the inside and keep the natives out on the outside. That was how the tactic worked. And essentially at the Battle of Blutrefier, they were able to do this with several hundred Voortrekkers. They were able to hold back many thousands of the enemy, who were obviously had to get in at close range, as this was Shaka's technique that I talked about in the video about Zulu military tactics.
Yeah, they didn't exactly have a lot of long-range weapons.
And
So you needed to get up close and personal. But still, like, having tens of thousands versus a couple of hundreds, this literally reminds me of the 300 Spartans, who fought alongside, I think, a couple of a few thousand Greeks against, I think it was Xerxes' armies?
This appears to have been very effective. The Voortrekkers didn't actually lose any of their men,
Not a single casualty, boys. Cheeks clapped.
whereas they succeeded in killing, they estimate, around 3,000 of the Zulus. This was a really great victory for the Voortrekkers, and obviously it meant that they could then go on to settle into new lands. Now, this also meant it was potentially already happening at this point. The chronology is a bit blurred, but there was a claimant to the throne, actually another half-brother of Dingaan called Bande. And potentially he was already rebelling against Dingaan at this point, but it sometimes is said that the loss of the Battle of Blutrefier by Dingaan's general was the catalyst for Bande to then rebel against him. And
Okay,
the
interesting history.
Voortrekkers, they obviously chose Mpande's side because Dingaan had killed Piet Retief and his party, and so they aided Mpande in fighting against his half-brother, and Mpande ended up winning, and they were able to succeed in fighting Dingaan.
I actually didn't know about this piece of history. Interesting that they actually allied with some of the Zulus to help the succession of a new king.
Now, in 1839,
This is like watching some Game of Thrones type of stuff here.
he actually granted them a piece of land, which they called the Natalia Republic, because it was in the area of Natal. Natal actually in Portuguese means Christmas, because it was
Yeah,
found
we covered that
around
earlier.
Christmas time by Vasco da Gama, I think. So that's the etymology. They also have a fun flag, which I think I covered in one of my old flag videos, because it's based again on the Dutch red, white and blue. As I said, at the Battle of Magonquo, they were successful in fighting against Dingaan, but actually the Voortrekker contingent never actually arrived at the battle.
Wait, they never made it? What?
They might have been too late, because I think that actually Mpande and his generals, they attacked before the Voortrekkers could arrive, but the Voortrekkers did manage to make away with 36,000 head of cattle, which seems to be they didn't really hold up their end of the deal.
Oh, you scoundrels.
And they got this big grant of land as well. Now, in 1843, the Natalia Republic was actually taken off them by the British, and this was because the British wanted to stop the Voortrekkers having access to a harbour and being internationally recognised, because the British had ambitions to control all of South Africa as a federation at this point. But there were the other two Boer republics that would remain, of the Oranje Vrystaat on the left and what was known to the British as Transvaal, although to the South Africans and the Voortrekkers and the Boers that founded it, it was known as the Suid-Afrikaanse Republiek, the South African Republic. Now, in 1852, we see that there is an invasion by the Zulu of Swaziland, which was home to a different group, the Swazi. And this
I think Swaziland is still here today. I haven't been there myself, but as far as I recall, it's still here today.
might actually have been caused because of population pressure from the Boers on the border with Zululand, that this is why Mpande feels the need to attack Swaziland and essentially rally his men behind him, because many of the Zulu were incredibly unhappy of what was happening with the Boers, because Mpande seems to have used the technique of appeasement rather than fighting them. But in 1856, actually, his son becomes the de facto ruler of Zululand. And Bande was still alive at this point, but his son Quechua, he actually fights against his half-brothers and kills a great
What is up with these half-brothers and fighting and killing each other? It's always the half-brother.
deal of them.
What are you doing, step bro? I've come for the throne.
And basically becomes the de facto ruler at that point. And Quechua has a very different attitude towards the Boers, and actually seems to incite lots of native peoples living in the Oranje Vrystaat and in the Suid-Afrikaanse Republiek to rebel against them. Now in 1856 we hear that both the Boers and the Zulu were actually patrolling around the same region because of disturbances that were occurring. And actually I thought I'd include this as not particularly significant or important, but this could have escalated into further conflict, although it didn't. It was mostly just really small scale kind of cattle theft and raiding, which seems to be done by both the Boers and the Zulus quite frequently. And I only mention this because actually a rather younger Paul Kruger was
Hey, that guy is my great not so great uncle. So yeah, related to him.
involved in on the Boer side of things, and obviously he will of course later on be very famous for his role in the Boer Wars that were to occur, the Second Boer War.
They're still waiting to find his stash of gold.
But I thought I'd include that. Now in 1877 the British actually annexed the South African Republic, the Suid-Afrikaanse Republiek, and that's why it also has the British name of Transvaal, because it was beyond the Vaal River. Now, one of the reasons why the Boers didn't actually fight back against this annexation was because they were worried that if they did, they would expose, let's say, their other flank to the Zulu, because there was that real fear. So actually the Zulu, despite not being in open war with the Boers after, you know, the whole debacle with Dingaan and the killing of Pieter de Tief and the Battle of Bloedrivier, they did play an important part in Afrikaner politics at the time. Now, as well, in
Okay.
1879,
know
of
about this.
course,
That's
we
pretty
have
interesting.
the fact that the British were looking to invade Zululand. They were trying to find any excuse they could to
Of course, typical British people. Maybe the excuse they gave, Governor, we have to invade. They have toothpaste.
invade Zululand and to add it to their possessions. And they did.
Man, it's weird to think just how far the British Empire has fallen. These people control vast swaths of land, and they were like, you know, rulers of the seas at some point, but now they're just a pathetic husk of what they used to be. Now, I'm not saying, you know, that you should go around, you know, invading other people's land, but I mean, they really have fallen off pretty hard.
Actually come to Paul Kruger and asked him to raise a troop of Boers to fight in the wars, but he refused this. He didn't want to fight under the British flag, but he did give them advice on how best to fight against the Zulus, because the Boers, of course, they had done this and, you know, they'd survived, let's say, because the Zulu were a force to be reckoned with. So he gave them advice on not marching in open column, you know, lagering your troops, so creating the lager of the wagons, and other things. But the British completely disregarded this advice, and you see the result.
Of course. FAFO, boys.
At the Battle of
That's probably one of the biggest I told you so's to the British.
and Loana. If they had created a better defensive structure, it seems unlikely that they would have been able to defeat the British in the way that they could at Isand Loana. Of course, the war did end with a British victory. This is the burning of Ulundi, which was the royal kraal at the time, and the capture of King Quechua. But it's not actually the end of the interaction between the British and the Zulu, because actually in 1880, the very year after, this is actually the year
That was so funny. Just randomly, your battery is low.
in which the First Boer War breaks out, which, you know, I have the video on. And this is again because now the Zulu threat has been removed. The Boers there feel confident enough to take on the British that they won't be raided and attacked by the Zulu, who had just suffered military and of course,
Okay, this was actually a pretty smart military my English died. Pretty smart military move. You don't want to attack an opponent when another one could easily stab you in the back. So once they've been neutralized, free to kick some British butt.
after the success of the Boers in this war, you get the Republic, the Suid-Afrikaanse Republiek, being independent once more. Now, the story of the Boers and the Zulu, even after the Zulu have been defeated, isn't quite over yet, though. And this was quite interesting. I had absolutely no idea about this before I started researching this video. And this is that in 1882, actually, the British realized they'd split the Zulu kingdom into 13 different little princedoms, essentially, each with a different chief. But they found that this was actually a really stupid idea because, of course, the Zulu had, they were a really centralized state under the king. The kings were really all-powerful, and if you remove that and you split it, you get kind of factionalism and warlordism, which wasn't great for the area. And actually, one of the chiefs that revolted against the British when the British tried to put Cetshwayo back on the throne was a chief called Zibebu, and I'm really hoping I'm getting the pronunciation on
Dude, you nailed the pronunciation. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise.
that one right. But he tried to create an independent Zululand again. Very interesting character. I'll probably have to look into this in a separate video. And he actually hired several of the Voortrekkers as... I'm saying Voortrekkers, I should be using Boer at this point because the trek was over. He hired several of them to be his mercenaries and to fight for him. And they actually...
I didn't even know this. The Zulus hired the Boers to fight for them against the British to create an independent state. I honestly wish that they would teach us stuff like this in school in South Africa. They never mentioned this.
He fought several running battles against Cetshwayo and British authorities and those Zulus, and were victorious in many of them. Although the son of King Cetshwayo, after they had burnt the royal kraal down, Cetshwayo died off in the forest sometime afterwards. His son, King Dinuzulu, actually also looked out and tried to hire several...
Wait, they actually got a picture of him? Sweet.
...of the Boers to be his mercenaries. And they fought against this joint army, and at the Battle of Ghost Mountain, they were able to defeat the chief. And he went on to be the ruler of the Zulu. Now, there was also another
Nieuwe Republiek, which I think means the newer republic.
interesting factoid, which is that after this point, the Nieuwe Republiek is founded, which also has a nice flag. This was founded because the king Dinuzulu actually granted this land to those Boers that had helped him, and this was actually had a connection to the coast, which the British didn't like, so they promptly went and tried.
Jeez, if you dare have a port, you can't have nothing these days. The British have an absolute stroking meltdown.
Tried to seize it, and this is the flag of it, which I think is just quite fun if you sort of place.
Oh yeah, so it's literally the green and the blue segments have been swapped around. Sweet.
Spot the difference with the flag of the Suid-Afrikaanse Republiek as well. Lots of the flags of the little Boer republics are very similar in design. These vierkleur kind of designs.
He said the thing. Vierkleur, which means four color.
Which I really quite enjoy. But anyway, I think that should be the end of this video because there's not really much more I can say at this point, because very soon the Boer republics would both be taken by the British after the Second Boer War, and of course the Zulus had failed to function as an independent nation by this point because they'd been defeated by the British. But I hope this video has been interesting. It's a very interesting part of history, and I
actually liked and enjoyed this a lot. This is something that, as I said before, I should have learned in high school, but they just don't teach you this type of history. It was very interesting. You know, the way that they frame it, it's like, oh, you know, a European man came here, killed everybody, and colonized. But there's just so much more intricate workings to this historical narrative of the history of South Africa. It was nice that he was able to cover a lot of this in depth, and even the not so important side quests that happens, you know, like when he mentioned Paul Kruger. Yeah,
I've looked
10 out of 10 video.
And the Boers largely sort of at them separately, but I think it's good to look at them sort of together as well and kind of plot the relationship between them. Do let me know in the comments below if you did enjoy this video and which other videos you'd like to see after this one. I think I'm going to do one on the Mufakane as well, because I think I've referenced that quite a lot, and there's a fair bit of discussion about that and its causes and effect and that kind of thing. But other than that, I think I'll wrap up these kind of videos on South Africa fairly soon and move over to another part of the world and take a look at that. But thank you very much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments below. Give me a thumbs up if you did, and if you're
100% already liked,
sharing it around. Thank you very much. This has been The History, and I have been Hilbert.
Clappies. That was a good one, boys. I liked it. I liked it a lot.